Okay, so I'm going to jump in and have a chat, talk about securing CI/CD pipelines. I think it's really important. Often, what I see is, CD, so Octopuses can be configured on HTTP rather than HTTPS. You see, the focus is on the security, is on the endpoints. That could be your web server or a web farm, for instance, and it's about protecting that. Your CI/CD pipeline is actually, it's very important to secure that, because you may find that one web server gets breached. However, if your CI/CD pipeline gets breached, then that technically could go to anywhere, and it's generally not. That's where I see the biggest risk with CI/CD pipelines. And some of the approaches that you can use is actually it's more about reducing the surface of attack, and one of those is Octopus service accounts. Within Octopus, you have the ability to have normal users and service accounts. Service accounts tend to be things that sit on the peripheral of Octopus. So you may have a Jenkins build server or Azure DevOps or both. I've saw people where they have lots of different build servers. And what you probably want is a service account for that build server. And just to give it some thought about how you provision your service account for your build server or other applications. Octopus has the concept of spaces. Spaces is a way for you to logically group but separate out your different projects into separate spaces. That's a good level to have a service account. It may be a little too high level. You may think about it as a project level or the project group level. You can also go down to the environment level, but generally I would recommend not doing this. The main thing is say you get to a point where Octopus has 2,000 projects and each has 4 environments. Suddenly you're looking at 8,000 service accounts. That's a completely separate security issue, mostly because people will forget APIs, etc., the API keys, and obviously that's very, very important to get that level of permission right. And also use an authentication provider. So you could even map that service account to a group within Octopus as well. And when you're using authentication providers, where possible, always map users to external groups. SSL, biggest tip I can recommend there is to use it everywhere, all the time. That's really important, but we will loop into that in just a moment. And then the spaces, definitely use spaces to separate out teams. So and projects, you may find that you have team A and team B, and they can have completely separate. They could actually have completely separate spaces and use different authentication providers. So there's that approach as well. And certainly using hardened workers. Workers is something that's imperative to take that away from your Octopus server from a security standpoint. And back to what you were saying earlier on, Leanne, about the sensitive variables. Use sensitive variables for sensitive variables. One of the biggest issues I see is people storing passwords in clear text as an Octopus variable because they need to double check things. If you need to double check your passwords before your deployment, you're probably doing it wrong, if I'm being honest. This is where you could just basically grab the secrets from a secret management. It could well be that Azure Key Vault, Secure Server, CyberArk, etc. But definitely don't leave that in clear text. And the benefit of storing it with an Octopus is you can never actually get it back out. It's only ever decrypted during deployment using the master key, so it's encrypted at rest. So, Leanne, one of the biggest issues I generally see with security is people often don't understand the difference between authentication versus authorization. Do you get that a lot?
Yeah, it's definitely something I've seen. It's tricky. They're very similar words, but they are different things that they cover. It's a very, very important differentiation.
Yeah. It's funny. I think it's because it happens almost simultaneously. Authentication is the method of confirming who a user is. So say, for instance, you have a user called Jane.doe. Jane has a password, and authentication is when Jane inputs her username and password, and the authentication provider comes back and says that's a successful logon. Authorization is actually the method of confirming of what level of access that Jane.doe has. So you may find you have resource 1 and resource 2. She may have access to resource one through an external group, and then but doesn't have access to two, or vice versa. So that is the difference between authentication and authorization. So one of the things I often get a question is, why use authentication providers? And that's a really good question. I think with authentication providers, it gives you that centralized single source of truth for authentication. So traditionally, you would have normally had Active Directory. You could have application users and passwords. The problem that presents is you could have, say, 17 different usernames and passwords. You may have the same password, you may not, but generally you have to go through 17 different systems and change all the details just to be sure. With the authentication provider, you have that one, that single source of truth for authentication, and that could be users, groups, etc. Also, with Octopus, you can also use more than one authentication provider. And one of the biggest benefits, I think, is single sign-on. So if you're authenticated against your authentication provider in Azure Active Directory or Active Directory, then you can just simply log in without putting in any username or password, because you're already authenticated. One of the benefits I like as well is you have privileged identity management. That could be someone who's a domain admin or a global administrator, or any level of administration. And with this is you often have privileged identity management and monitoring. So you could use something to monitor and see how risky a login is, automatically have it drop off and reset the username and the password for the user at next logon. So there's lots of peripheral services and benefits around authentication providers. And what it does do as well is it also gives you an easy access review, because you only have to audit one authentication provider. But definitely, I think the biggest benefit is multi-factor authentication. And the question is here is, what is a multi-factor authentication? It's in the description. It's using multiple forms of authentication. It generally includes a username and password. That tends to be what you know. And then the second bit is something you have or are. And quite often that can be a phone. So it could be your app, a Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator. It could be your thumbprint, for instance, as well. But it's definitely something to use. And the benefit, you could actually tell someone, and I'm not saying you should, please don't go and tell everyone your username and password. But what you could technically do is tell someone your username and password, and then they still can't log on because the multi-factor authentication, because they don't have access to your phone. So that's just something to think about. So let's talk about some Octopus authentication. Octopus comes in two different flavors. You have the Octopus Server and Octopus Cloud. Server's been about since 2012. Cloud was launched in 2018. And some of the authentication providers that we support is username and password, Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, Google, Okta, and Octopus ID. So Octopus Server, you can spin it up and just have a built-in username and password, and you don't have to integrate it with Active Directory, for instance. More often than not, I generally find people do integrate it with Active Directory, and that does work on premise. Along with that, so does Azure Active Directory, Google, Okta as well, but Octopus ID doesn't. And we do have detailed documentation on how to set this up. So let's jump over to Octopus Cloud. Username and password is supported, but only via Octopus ID. We have Active Directory, and that unfortunately isn't supported with Octopus Cloud. The main reason for that is you normally have to be on the same network, or at least connect to a domain controller. Azure Active Directory and Google are both supported in cloud. However, this is done only via Octopus ID. And it doesn't support Okta, but Octopus ID, it was built for the cloud. So the question is, what's Octopus ID? Octopus ID is an Octopus developed authentication provider. It allows the same user that you have specified on octopus.com when you've spun up your cloud account to then log that the same details into your Octopus cloud account. It supports Microsoft accounts, so that's via Azure Active Directory and Google Authentication. And then also it also supports username and password. Let's have a quick look at that. So if we jump over, we can see octopus.com. So when you're signing in or register, you have the option of Google, Microsoft, and then your username and password. Okay, so let's jump into a few common setups. So this is the typical setup for your on-premise. You'll normally have a user normally using Chrome, and then they're connecting into Octopus. Octopus is normally run under a service account, which is an Active Directory service account. And then from there, you can pull in the username. You map that to Active Directory and then use username and password to sign in. This is the common setup for Octopus Cloud. You've not got the user browser, go to Octopus. They then use Octopus ID to authenticate, and that can be Azure Active Directory, username and password, or Google Apps. Now, let's jump onto the one that we're doing today. Let's start over at the right-hand side, Active Directory. So the way this is set up is I have a domain controller in my home. I'm syncing that up to Azure Active Directory on a tenant called derekcampbell.dev. There's two-way synchronization set up, so any changes in the cloud get synced back on-premise and vice versa. So one thing to be aware of is obviously we have users and groups being synced up to Azure Active Directory and then are logging in using that. I have disabled username and password. The main reason for that is it stops brute force attacks on the Octopus server. You technically could do this. Also, if you set this up and it's in this instance, it's in Azure. So if you set something where it's on a cloud self-hosted on AWS, Google, Azure, etc., you could technically just have a site-to-site VPN and bypass Azure Active Directory and do that. So it can support Active Directory, but you do need probably some form of site-to-site VPN or ExpressRoute, etc., to connect in. So yeah, that's the authentication provider that we are going to be demoing today. So let's jump over and have a quick look. So we're going to come over. Just one thing just to be aware of is we also have multi-factor authentication set up here. So myself, I have two different accounts. I have my business as usual or my day-to-day account, which is derek@derekcampbell.dev. This is a non-admin account from the aspect of Octopus. However, what it is there we go, let's sign in. So this is a global admin at Azure level, but it's been configured with multi-factor authentication regardless. And this has been configured to only be able to view setup. So I'm just opening up my phone. I'm selecting approve. You'll see that this will log me in. There we go. We are in. So this will take us into Azure. You're probably wondering why I'm logging into Azure, because we're using Azure. And one of the benefits is once I've signed in here, what we should find is I can sign into Octopus straight away. That's the benefit of multi-factor authentication. You can have that single sign-in set up. So let's jump in and have a look at Azure Active Directory. So we can see here, we go to users. As you can see, we've got admin Derek, admin Leanne, Derek, and Leanne. And one of the things just to be aware of is when we set this up, we used a app registration and then set up. This is all in the documentation on octopus.com/docs. And then we've set the manifest. We've created a Octopus administrators group and an Octopus users group. And Derek and Leanne are in the Octopus users group, and admin Derek and admin Leanne are in Octopus administrators. So you use the manifest file to map that out, and then you can then map these in Octopus. So just one thing to be aware of. We'll see that I'm logged in here as Derek. So we'll come into the project. You'll see here, project edit permissions required. And I'll just confirm. You can come in and you can only really see the bare minimum. So you come into users, you can see that I'm listed here. Go to teams, and then what you'll see is there's a Octopus users, and then that is mapped out. And what you can actually do is show all members, and this show that Derek and Leanne are part of the Octopus users Azure Active Directory. Okay, so let's take us, let's jump over. Let's sign in. I'm going to again sign into Azure first. The main reason is if I don't sign in, this, and then I need to do it twice. So just, there we go. This also has multi-factor authentication. And one approach here is to only use, one thing I see is often multi-factor authentication is only enabled for admins. That's also an approach, but yeah, generally just apply it across the board. Select verify, because as well as that, it will also help with your other applications. So you can see here, I'm logging in, select no, and then from here, we should then have access to, there we go, excellent. So again, same idea, with access to the same tenant, we can see the application registration, and then you can see here. So let's sign in with Microsoft. There we go. How easy was that? I do like a nice, easy login. So again, same idea. As you can see, I've got admin. We come into Teams. We come into Octopus administrators. And then as you can see here, I've mapped this out. Show all members, and then there should be 3. We do also have a rogue admin account. So yeah, that's how you set up multi-factor authentication for Octopus via Azure DevOps. And one thing just to be aware of, like I said, you can have more than one authentication provider. So let's jump over to admin Derek. So as you can see, my email address via Azure Active Directory is admin-derek at derekcampbell.dev. And then you also have Google Apps. So I can not only can I log in with my Azure Active Directory, but I can also log in with my octopus.com email. It's quite good to have a backup authentication provider that you can use. Potentially as well, you can also just drop down to command line. And one thing just to be aware of, if you need to enable any of these, it's under settings. You come into Active Directory, you can see that Active Directory is disabled. We also have Azure Active Directory. This is enabled, and you'll see there's a client ID and then an issuer. If you jump back to Azure, if we come down to properties, you'll see here that we have a directory ID which ends in 1E4. So we come back to here, you can see here that the issuer is 1E4 as well. So that's the same ID. This is basically specifying the tenant you're authenticating against. And then the next one is application registration. Come in here, and then you'll see the application or the client ID here where it's BF3. And then what you'll see here is within the client ID is BF3. So that's specifying the application registration ID and the issuer, and that's how it puts those two together and authenticates. Then we also have Google Apps as well. This is, I've set this up on octopus.com. And then lastly, you can see here Octopus ID as well. That's just something to be aware of. So yeah, and we've got some Okta stuff there as well. We also have that information. And one of the biggest things that I generally recommend is to disable username and password. You're probably thinking why, but it just effectively removes any sort of brute force attack on your Octopus server. They would only have the ability to use an authentication provider. But saying that, you always have to have a Octopus user. You just can't you just can't log in with it. So as you can see here, whenever you create something in an authentication provider, it has to map it back to a user within Octopus. So as much as I logged in here, but as you can see, we also have 2 different authentication providers this person can log on with.